Western civilization. How much do you know? My name is Russell Miles, and this is the 15th episode of our Western Civilization series. In the previous episode, we looked at people's responses to disease, the Black Death, social and economic impacts, and the development of social distancing as a means of protection. In this episode, we're going to look at other cultures' responses to pandemics and the impact on Indigenous people in the age of exploration and conquest. The Black Death of the 13th century swept along trade routes and devastated the Islamic peoples of Persia, Syria, Egypt, and along the African coast of the Mediterranean, killing millions. The experiences of Islamic culture are a constructive mirror to the West. The Egyptian scholar Al-Mazriqi noted that more than 300 tribes all perished without apparent reason in their summer and winter encampments, in the course of pasturing their flocks and during the seasonal migration. According to the historian Ibn Tagiri-Birdi, young men were resigned to die and did little apart from performing prayers. Funeral processions in Cairo during the Black Death were described as so numerous that they could not pass in the roadways without disturbing another procession. Islamic law sees plague as an opportunity from God for Muslims to make evident their faith. This ideal saw stricter enforcement of laws against alcohol and moral behaviour. Muslims were instructed to not enter nor flee from a plague-stricken land. These traditions were attributed to the battles for Syria in 638, where the Caliphate forbid military commanders to withdraw when the army was afflicted by plague. The Muslim army was eventually victorious over the Byzantine forces. Regardless, there are various records of people trying to escape the plague. According to the chronicler Al-Mazriqi, the Sultan left Cairo between September and December 1348. Later Islamic scholars viewed plague as a natural calamity which an unknowable God had decreed. This entailed an obligation to care for the afflicted and bury the dead with religious rites before leaving a plague-stricken community. The Qin Dynasty 1250 to 1382 greatly developed Egypt, building Cairo from a small town in one of the foremost cities of the world. But the Black Death, with waves of pandemics up to the early 16th century, depopulated the land and caused the ruin of the Nile Delta irrigation system. Anatolia, modern-day southeast Turkey, was a patchwork of independent Turkish tribes, including that of Osman I in the 13th century. With the Black Death weakening both the Egyptian Mazri dynasty and the Byzantine Empire, the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire emerged. The Ottomans were to endure from the 14th to the early 20th century and controlling most of southeast Europe. The population of pre-European contact Americas, 1492, is estimated to range between 40 to 60 million. By 1650, the indigenous population of the Americas was A. less than 6 million, B. between 6 and 10 million, C. between 10 and 14 million, or D. about 16 million. The ancestors of Australia's Aboriginals travelled by sea from what is the Indonesian archipelago around 40 to 50,000 years ago. Aboriginal peoples consider they have always been here. This great time period makes them the longest continuing human culture by far. With the end of the last glacial period around 11,000 years ago, Aboriginals experienced limited external contact. In 1770, English explorer James Cook charted the east coast of what was then referred to as Crux Australis, Great Southern Land. The population of Indigenous Australians at this time has been estimated to be between 300 and 500,000. With regard to diseases, the Aboriginals probably suffered from hepatitis B, some bacterial infections, and intestinal parasites. They had not previously been exposed to smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, venereal syphilis, gonorrhea, diseases that were common in 17th century Europe.
Sydney Cove was the home of the Aurora people when the first fleet of European convicts and soldiers arrived in 1788 to establish a port. They had two notable leaders, Bennelong and Pomeroy. Bennelong was said to be friendly and cooperative. Pomeroy was more suspicious. When the newcomers depleted local fisheries and game, Pomeroy commenced a decade-long guerrilla war. Pomeroy was finally captured and beheaded after having been betrayed by Bennelong, by which time the introduced diseases and deprivation had reduced the Aurora people by half. From 1830, colonisation significantly accelerated with an open settlement policy. Within a generation, settlements had spread along much of the eastern seaboard and inland from Adelaide and Perth. Aboriginal peoples were displaced from the most fertile land, water sources and fisheries. By 1900, the recorded Indigenous population of Australia had declined to approximately 93,000. The Indigenous population continued to decline, reaching a low of 74,000 in 1933, before numbers slowly began to recover. In 1937, the Aboriginal Welfare Conference decided that the official policy for Aboriginal people of mixed descent was to be assimilated into white society, and those not living tribally were to be educated, and others to stay on reserves. In 2016, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, there was a child death rate of 146 per 100,000 for Indigenous children, compared with 70 for non-Indigenous children. People lived in the Americas for 20,000 years before the arrival of Europeans. The impact of disease, violence, and cultural denigration on Indigenous Americans has been studied for many centuries, with ongoing revisions of the death toll upwards. In many areas of the Americas, people were largely hunters and gatherers, with civilizations along the Pacific coast around what is now Peru and also Central America, including cities such as Teotihuacan, located near present-day Mexico City, which likely housed 200,000 people and was comparable to Paris, which was the largest city in Europe at the time. There were pyramid structures over 230 metres tall. The Inca Empire was connected by a road system of 40,000 kilometres. There were large-scale irrigation systems, terrace farming, harvesting of maize, cotton and squash. The Aztecs and Mayas had created the abacus. They had built apartment blocks and aqueducts. There was metallurgy, including electroplating. And the Olmec independently invented the concept of a zero, which was important in the creating of a calendar. Earlier estimates of the Indigenous population was based on Spanish tax and Paris record, suggesting there were 10 million people in pre-contact America. Later, more detailed research placed the population at 40 to 60 million. Analysis based on land support metrics placed the population at over 100 million. This is on the assumption that 1/5 of the land was used in agriculture, which was comparable to Europe, India and China that had 1/3 of their land utilised for farming. The best estimate of the population of pre-contact America is around 50 million. On 12 October 1492, a group of Taino gathered on what was now called San Salvador Island to welcome Columbus's sailors. The Taino were estimated to number 60,000 and possibly as many as 8 million. By 1548, the Taino population had plummeted to less than 500. In 1520, Spanish forces entered the capital of the Aztec Empire, Teotihuacan, in what is now Mexico. Within months, smallpox had swept through, killing nearly half the population, estimated at 50 to 300,000 people. Estimates of Aztec population decline, including deaths from disease, breakdown of society, starvation and collapse of births, has been ranged from 1/3 to as high as 90%. Around the Newfoundland and Maine coasts, Pierre Bard, a Jesuit missionary, noted, the Indians are astonished and often complain that since the French mingle and carry on trade with them, they are dying fast and the population is thinning out. From the mid-1600s, the estimates of the Native American population was around 6 million. Perhaps 1 in 10 of the globe's population had gone in the greatest of killings. The impact of introduced disease has been ongoing. In the 1950s and 60s, Yanomami people living near the Venezuelan border were nearly wiped out by measles after contact with outsiders. In late 1910, reports reached Beijing that plague had broken out in Vuchitina in northern Manchuria. The area was near the Siberian border and subject to Japanese and Russian intrusion, local warlords and armed conflict. The Chinese Qin Dynasty was in disarray. Empress Cixi had not long died, leaving a child emperor, and the land was fermenting with rebellion. The Chinese authorities had rejected Russian and Japanese aid, fearing territorial domination. Authorities were also concerned that Lunar New Year would spread the disease as people travelled to their home regions. Chinese authorities dispatched Dr. Wu Lien-the to manage the response. Dr. Wu was of Chinese heritage from Malay. He had trained at Cambridge University, the Pasteur Institute, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, lectured in Singapore, researched and had written widely about infectious diseases, and had recently been appointed as a Deputy Director of the Chinese Imperial Army College. Dr. Wu proceeded to take control of railways and riverboats to curtail travel. He also instigated mass inspection of train and ship passengers. He ordered rail lines and ferries to Dalian to be shut down, and the plague never reached the port. 3,000 doctors, along with nurses, soldiers and police, were mobilised to assist in the door-to-door search for those who were affected. Any lodging house where an infection appeared was burnt to the ground. Other initiatives included rapid construction of plague hospitals to isolate the infected and potentially infected from ordinary hospital patients. He had 60,000 face masks, then a novel idea produced and distributed. He established a newspaper to provide information such as encouragements to stay at home and avoid social contact. Dr. Wu conducted a post-mortem of an early victim when such was usually not accepted in Chinese culture. Local people practiced burial of the dead. With the ground frozen, bodies were becoming a health hazard. Dr. Wu spoke with civic leaders and sought an imperial edict to persuade them of the necessity of quick disposal of the bodies. The epidemic killed an estimated 60,000 people in the affected region of Manchuria, but was effectively contained within 7 months. Dr. Wu was to chair an international plague conference in Mukin in April 2011, an historical event attended by scientists from around the world. He became the first director of Manchuria's plague service, and in 1930 was the first director of Chinese National Quarantine Service. The Lancet Medical Journal has an annual Wakely Wu Lien-the Prize in honour of Dr. Wu and the publication's founding editor Thomas Wakely.
Our next podcast will be about influenza and cholera and the development of epidemiology, the science of the pattern and nature of disease. In the meanwhile, the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 was so named because A. The initial patient was an American soldier with a Latino family name. B. The origins of the disease were in Spain. Or C. News that the King of Spain had become ill with an unknown disease. Or D. Allied powers wanted to disguise that the pandemic had originated in the United States. The answer will be in the next podcast. If you like this channel, please subscribe and tick like. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I can be contacted at emails russmills@iprimus.com.au. Thank you for listening.